This talk is about how the early atmosphere of the Earth could have delivered some of the important molecules for life to begin. I'm David Catling, a professor in the Department of Earth and Space Sciences at the University of Washington in Seattle. And the middle part of this talk will switch temporarily to presentation by Nick Wogan, who's a PhD student doing research about the prebiotic atmosphere. So this is a tag team effort. The basic problem of the origin of life is how geochemistry became biochemistry. Most people agree that the definition of life requires some sort of genome. Most people also think, for that reason, that metabolism on its own, without informational self-replication, does not qualify as life. So related to this concept is that since the mid-1980s, most biochemists and organic chemists have agreed that a step on the way to life was RNA world, in which self-replicating RNA existed, and RNA served both as a genetic molecule and as a catalyst. But to get to RNA world, you have to make ribonucleotides, which are shown in the middle of this diagram, which consist of a phosphate, a ribose sugar, and a heterocyclic base of either 2 rings in the purines or 1 in the pyrimidines. Well, successful published prebiotic schemes have employed various precursor models assumed to be available in the environment, which are called feedstocks, such as nitriles, the simplest of which is hydrogen cyanide, and other possible simple molecules, a subset of which are listed here on the left. At some point, the genetic material needs to be encapsulated in a lipid membrane, and amino acids have to be made and co-opted to make proteins for enzymes and structure. In the past 10 to 15 years, successful pathways with relatively high yield of biomolecules have been worked out that use the same simple building blocks. And cyanide is a key component of such schemes. A cyanide-based origin of life has been advocated by organic chemists for decades because cyanide is a nucleophile. Okay, what does that mean? It means a species that donates an electron pair to form a bond. This carbon-carbon bond-forming capability is considered to be a fundamental result of prebiotic chemistry research by many organic chemists and has received substantial support from experiments. So, for example, the early experiments made adenine, which is essentially a pentameter of HCN. Even the building block of sugars, formaldehyde, can be made from HCN. You can reduce it, and then you can hydrolyze the reduced product, and it will make formaldehyde in a certain pH regime. If you take these simple starting materials such as HCN, SO2 or H2S, and UV light, it's been shown that you can make nucleotides, amino acids, and lipid precursors in a systems chemistry approach. So you make these important biomolecules all at the same time in what's called one-pot chemistry. And cyanide really is the critical feedstock molecule in these reaction networks. So this table shows precursors or possible secondary products for synthesis of components of RNA building blocks. For example, hydrogen cyanide is a precursor for components of nucleobases, or cyanacetylene is used to make the pyrimidine nucleobases, and so on. And the important common element in these starting ingredients is that they are known to be produced in atmospheric photochemistry. In some cases, such as cyanacetylene, which is used to make the pyrimidines, there is no source that is as plausible as an atmospheric source. So this motivates us to think about atmospheric photochemistry. What we know in particular is that nitriles, so organic compounds with a CN functional group, are formed in reducing atmospheres that contain nitrogen and some methane. The locality where we can directly observe atmospheric nitrile synthesis in action is the largest moon of Saturn, Titan, which has a lower atmosphere made of about 95% nitrogen and 5% methane. Nitriles are shown in this, such as cyanacetylene, and the simplest one, hydrogen cyanide, are shown on the left here, above an image of Titan. Well, how do they form? The general principle in atmospheric chemistry is that reactions are driven by radicals, that is, species with unpaired electrons, and a continuous source of radicals is photolysis, when molecules are split by sunlight. The formation of HCN is such a case. It's formed from the photolysis products of methane and nitrogen, as shown here in these reactions. And then the radicals that are derived from the methane, along with the nitrogen atoms, can combine to make HCN. From cyanide, the other nitriles can be formed from the reaction of radicals and hydrogen cyanide. So this is shown in a schematic diagram here of major pathways for cyanacetylene and also cyanogen. On the early Earth, if we imagine that it had a hazy atmosphere, there would also be other molecules around, which makes it quite different from Titan. In particular, the early Earth would be at a far warmer temperature regime than Titan, and so it'd have plenty of CO2 gas and water vapor. CO2 and water are ices on the surface of Titan, which is around 94 Kelvin. Consequently, early Earth was far more favorable than Titan's atmosphere for producing oxygen-containing compounds, including carbohydrate components, such as formaldehyde in particular. But not all of the sugar compounds need to be made in the atmosphere. So, for example, glycoaldehyde can be made from photochemical reactions with ethene and OH radicals and other things that you might expect in an atmosphere with some oxygen atoms in it. But it's probably more efficiently made in aqueous phase reactions, as discussed by Harman et al. In 2013.
This is Nick Wogan, and I'll pick up the talk for the next few slides. Another consequence of methane photochemistry is the production of hydrocarbon particles, which can make an atmosphere hazy like Titan's, which is shown in this photo. There are a couple ways hazes can form, and this slide just shows one of them right here. So in this case, methane photolysis makes methylene radicals, and these radicals can react with themselves to form acetylene, C2H2. The acetylene can then react with its own photolysis product, C2H, to make C4H2. And then this pattern continues, making bigger and bigger hydrocarbons, which become so big they eventually condense into little spheres. This photo is from a lab experiment which shows the little spherical haze particles that are about 50 nanometers in diameter. From looking at Titan's atmosphere, people think that these little spheres eventually stick together while they float around in the atmosphere, making fluffy little clumps, which have a fractal structure. Also, lab experiments suggest that haze only forms if the methane to CO2 ratio exceeds about 0.1. This isn't important for Titan because it's too cold for CO2 gas on Titan, but this is relevant to the early Earth, which probably had CO2. So, was the Hadean atmosphere methane and nitrogen rich, like Titan's? If it was, then maybe it would have been hazy and would have produced prebiotic molecules like hydrogen cyanide and cyanacetylene. There is a geologic argument for the Hadean atmosphere not having much methane, and instead, most of the time, having a carbon dioxide and nitrogen-rich atmosphere. The argument goes something like this. Volcanic gases should have supplied the Hadean atmosphere. modern volcanoes outgas water, carbon dioxide, and nitrogen, and not their reduced equivalents, hydrogen, methane, and ammonia. The oxidation state of the mantle has probably not changed a lot since core formation, so Hadean volcanoes produced a carbon dioxide nitrogen atmosphere. This topic is often debated and has been debated for many, many years, but there is some reasonable evidence to support this argument. The geochemistry of the oldest zircon grains, which are about 4.3 billion years old, suggests that Earth's mantle oxidation state has not changed a lot since. But there are some really big error bars on those measurements. Also, experiments show that iron oxide disproportionation during planet formation should oxidize the upper mantle and move it closer to its modern oxidized state. But volcanoes aren't the only possible source of methane in the Hadean. People have suggested a few other possible sources. Some have proposed abiotic methane from deep-sea serpentinizing hydrothermal vents. We have hydrothermal vents on the modern Earth, like the one shown in this photo right here. And some of these vents have dissolved methane floating around them. For many years, people thought this methane was produced by non-living processes, but recent work suggests that a lot of this methane that people see ultimately comes from life. It probably comes from the breakdown of dead organic stuff floating in the seawater. So hydrothermal vents could have maybe made some methane on the Hadean Earth, but maybe not enough to fuel the production of a lot of prebiotic molecules in the atmosphere. Another potential source of methane is impact degassing. Asteroids and comets have a lot of volatiles. People think that these volatiles would be released directly to the atmosphere during an impact. Some models predict a lot of methane produced during impact degassing, and others predict really tiny amounts. The models that predict a lot generally invoke metal catalysts that speed up the reactions that make methane. But it's really hard to model catalysts properly and to know how many catalysts would be around during these impacts, so it isn't really clear exactly how much methane would be produced from impact degassing. And finally, maybe the biggest source of short-term methane in the Hadean were impactors larger than about 100 kilometers in diameter. These impacts could have made temporary atmospheres with up to several bars of methane. I'm going to take the next few slides to talk more about this potential methane source. So when a really big impact hits the Earth, it probably vaporizes a huge fraction of the ocean, or all of the ocean, depending on the impactor size, and leaves behind a really hot, steamy atmosphere. The iron from the impactor could react with steam in the atmosphere to make a lot of hydrogen, and then as the atmosphere cools over a couple thousand years, the hydrogen can equilibrate with carbon in the atmosphere to make methane. Eventually, the steam condenses back to an ocean, and you are left with an atmosphere with a lot of hydrogen, CO2, nitrogen, and a little bit of methane. This plot shows a model of a steam atmosphere after a 500 kilometer impact, which would have been barely big enough to vaporize the whole ocean. Before the impact happens, the atmosphere has 3 bars of carbon dioxide and 1 bar of nitrogen. The plot has time on the x-axis, partial pressures on the left axis, and temperature on the right-hand axis, which is referenced to this dotted black line. This is a model of chemical kinetics. It keeps tracks of hundreds of forward and backward chemical reactions that produce and destroy each molecule in the atmosphere. When the atmosphere first begins to cool, after the impact, it's really hot and the reactions are fast, allowing for more and more methane to be produced. Because methane likes to be more abundant at colder temperatures, it's thermodynamically more stable at lower temperatures. Eventually, the atmosphere gets cold enough that the reactions making methane become really slow, and they basically stop making methane, and that's why methane stops getting more abundant a couple years, 100 years into the simulation. After the steam condenses, the atmosphere has about 1 bar of CO2, half a bar of nitrogen, 4 bars of hydrogen, and 0.003 bars of methane. This is just one model. Different sized impacts with different initial atmospheres will make more or less methane, but in the biggest impacts, potentially a few bars of methane could be made. The atmosphere produced by a big impact would then evolve photochemically. This figure is a photochemical model of the atmosphere after the steam condenses, following the 500-kilometer impact I showed on the previous slide. Time is on the horizontal axis in millions of years, partial pressures on the left-hand axis, and hydrogen cyanide production is on the right-hand axis, reference to this brown dotted line. In this case, methane is destroyed and hydrogen cyanide is produced for about 100,000 years after the impact. This model doesn't include other prebiotic molecules like cyanoacetylene or cyanogen, but they almost certainly would have been produced as well. Methane production would last longer or shorter depending on how much methane was initially produced by the impact. So for smaller impacts that make less methane, maybe the hydrogen cyanide would be produced for 10,000 years, and for really big impacts that make a lot of methane, then hydrogen cyanide might be produced for 1 million years or a couple million years. This period of time, when hydrogen cyanide and other prebiotic molecules are produced, could be a nice little window of opportunity for life to begin. Although, one potential problem is that hydrogen-rich atmospheres can be pretty hot. This plot shows surface temperature as a function of hydrogen, partial pressure, in bars. So if you have more than 10 bars of hydrogen, then the surface temperature will be hotter than 100 degrees Celsius, which might not be the best environment for life to begin. Over a couple million years, the hydrogen eventually escapes to space, allowing for the surface to eventually cool down.
This is David Catling talking again. One aspect of the models just presented is that it's assumed that some level of atmospheric CO2 is present in the Hadean eon from 4.5 to 4 billion years ago. But what was the partial pressure of CO2? On million-year timescales, the atmospheric CO2 concentration is regulated by the carbonate-silicate cycle shown schematically in the upper left here. CO2 dissolves in rainwater to make carbonic acid, which chemically weathers continental rocks and also the basaltic seafloor. Seafloor weathering is small on the modern Earth, but potentially much more important on the early Earth because of a greater seafloor production rate and less land. In the carbonate-silicate cycle, carbon ends up in carbonate sediments, is calcium carbonate shown, or carbonate veins and crystals in the seafloor rocks. Well, this is a negative feedback system because on a hot Earth, the CO2 gets drawn down in weathering rapidly, the reactions go faster and there's more rainfall, which makes the Earth's climate cooler and more temperate. Whereas on a cold Earth, weathering is slow and CO2 emitted from volcanoes builds up, which warms the planet. In the Hadean, also, the large flux of impactors creates considerable impact ejecta, which is easy to weather and sequesters carbon dioxide. So models show that the impact ejecta sequestration of CO2, in fact, generally dominates the system. Looking at the figures below, these show the evolution of Earth's surface environment from a 2020 paper. In the control case, which is no ejecta weathering, the dashed line, CO2 adjusts to be higher than modern, shown in the dotted line, to compensate for the faint young sun. Surface temperature remains moderate owing to the negative feedback of the geological carbon cycle. The PCO2 that's labeled in the standard case, which includes the impact ejecta and its weathering, is lower than that of the control case, particularly in the early Hadean. The lower PCO2 also results in a lower surface temperature than the case without ejecta, and there's a good possibility that the surface temperature is lower than 273 Kelvin, in what Kevin Zarnley, in an earlier lecture, called the Hadean Ice Age. And this is especially true in the very early Hadean of 4.3 to 4.4 billion years ago. However, the orange area shows the large uncertainty in the results represented by uncertainty in the model parameters. So although it's likely that the Hadean was cold, we don't know for sure. There are certain parameter sets that result in a warmer early Hadean. Another issue related to all of this is that in prebiotic schemes, the precursors produced in the atmosphere, such as hydrogen cyanide, need to be concentrated and taken up into aqueous solution at the surface to the level of tens of millimolar or even molar concentrations to drive reactions forward. Also, other geochemical species, such as phosphate, need to be concentrated for the prebiotic chemistry. Well, how can we do this? A promising idea is concentration in bodies of water at the surface, namely lakes or ponds. In particular, sodium carbonate-rich lakes have properties that would concentrate both cyanides and phosphates. There have been experimental and modeling studies for noxic chemical weathering in the presence of carbon dioxide of mafic rocks, that is to say, igneous rocks rich in magnesium and iron and low in silica, such as basalt. These indicate that acid is consumed, the carbonic acid, which increases the pH of solution. Carbonate species concentrate. Sodium migrates into the aqueous phase relative to divalent calcium, magnesium, and iron cations. Precipitation of secondary silicate minerals, that is to say clays, consumes the divalent ions magnesium and iron, and also potassium. So this leads to the result that the divalent ions, calcium, magnesium, and iron, are limited in their concentration by the precipitation of carbonates of these cations. So the net result produces a sodium bicarbonate-rich lake shown up here in the upper left that we might expect in a closed basin on the early Earth. And cyanide will form a complex of ferrocyanide in solution. And if the closed basin lake evaporates, then these species will get concentrated. Also, by removing the calcium from solution as carbonate, phosphate that is fluxed in from weathering of the surrounding catchment area can build up to tens of micromolar or even molar concentrations because phosphate is not removed as insoluble calcium phosphate, the mineral apatite. And this has been demonstrated in experiments and models of this Turner and Catling 2020 PNAS paper. Such carbonate-rich lakes were likely common on early Earth and Mars because they arise from inevitable processes of mafic rock weathering under CO2-rich atmospheres and evaporation. If you completely evaporate such a ferrocyanide-rich and phosphate-rich lake, the solids effectively stockpile useful prebiotic feedstocks, which would metamorphose and then rehydrate to sodium cyanide, which is a common nucleophilic reagent for organic chemists, some oxides, and sodium carbonate and sodium phosphate. So such a sodium cyanide-rich and phosphate-rich solution is potentially suitable for a cyanide origin of life. Well, to summarize the talk then, we started with the idea that modern life is RNA-based as much as it is DNA-based, and the most important molecules that have been used successfully to generate RNA nucleobases in prebiotic chemistry is HCN, hydrogen cyanide. Simple carbohydrates to make the ribose component of RNA and other nitriles are also useful. In particular, one nitrile, cyanoacetylene, HCCN, which is used to generate the pyrimidines, only has a known plausible source of atmospheric chemistry. We know that the kind of photochemistry that generates HCN and other nitriles is that in N2-rich atmospheres with some methane. Titan is a modern example of the atmospheric generation of nitriles in action. However, the early Earth is not Titan. It would be far warmer, and early Earth would have oxygen-containing bulk gases such as CO2 and water vapor, these species are ices, at the surface of Titan, but we wouldn't expect that at the surface of early Earth. On the early Earth, we also expect a CO2 N2 rich atmosphere on average based on the expected composition of volcanic gases, which is not highly reducing and contains negligible methane, at least from high temperature regions. The level of atmospheric CO2 would be regulated by the carbonate silicate cycle. So that has carbon dioxide sinks of land, seafloor, and impact ejector. And in fact, models show that impact ejector is generally a big sink for the expected Hadean impact flux. Furthermore, for the quiescent Hadean, we do not expect methane levels to be high because abiotic emissions of CH4 from the solid Earth are generally small. So how do we have a suitable atmosphere to make nitriles on the early Earth? Well, when large impactors strike the Earth, their iron core can react with water and make considerable amounts of hydrogen equivalent to many bars of surface pressure. In the process of heat and thermal reduction, CO2 gets converted to methane. So the result is a type of atmosphere that generates HCN, plenty of it, other nitriles, as well as simple carbohydrates, but for nitriles at very much greater rates than on Titan because of the greater solar flux at Earth's orbit. Physico-chemical models results shown earlier by Nick Wogan show that this is what happens. Finally, prebiotic chemical schemes require concentrated reactants in water in the range of tens of millimole or even molar concentrations. Such conditions can be achieved in lakes and ponds at the surface of the Earth, which can concentrate reactants by removal of water in evaporation or freezing. Recent experiments and models show that the inorganic chemistry of lakes that favors both concentration of cyanides and phosphate is that of sodium carbonate lakes. Such lakes are expected to be common products of water catchments on the early Earth. Thanks for listening.